Picking up where I had left off at in my last live before my phone overheated and began to cut me off and die. I had to rush and put it in the freezer. Um, I was covering the atrocities of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front here, and here they are. I was talking about what they had done in their prison system that they had established, which they had a POW camp, an extermination center, and a prison system for regular prisoners within their territory, just your standard run-of-the-mill criminals. It was ran by this man, Professor Albertson here, who was a former math professor of the University of Iowa, and he was the one of the three members of the Troika, along with Colonel McGregor here, an ex-Green Beret, retired 4 years by the beginning of the internal conflict, who was its de facto military leader, and there was Alfred Motufu, the leader of the paramilitary forces called the Jolly Roger Death Brigades, and that is their logo. They are separate from the regular forces of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, who have this logo. And he is also its de facto political leader and its propaganda chief, policy head, as being part of the political leadership there. The head of the political leadership makes him the policy head, although Colonel McGregor was the liaison between all three of them, essentially. He coordinated the activities of the entire Troika, the three of them, while Professor Albertson here was the head of the prison system, but also he was the economic and logistical leader of the Troika. So they three comprised the leadership of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, who were hell-bent on cleansing America and building their own new version of America built on a secular humanist ultranationalism that they concocted. They all wanted to change America. Originally, they began with noble intentions, but eventually they took everything in a very warped, radical direction. So radical, in fact, that they felt the need to build a god out of blood from the ground up, which was their actual slogan that they had came up with for the NSRF. Their crimes, besides their purgings that they had conducted in the penal facilities ran by Professor Albertson here, their crimes, hello everybody, their crimes also included the use of chemical weapons. In fact, they were the faction that used the most chemical weapons out of the three factions that had chemical weapons, the other two being the rogue globalist regime, but also the Mormon State was also in possession of chemical weapons, although they did not use theirs as much in a concentrated form. Hi there, Heather. Hey, El Romero. They did not, hey, Brogan. They did not use their chemical weapons in as concentrated of a form as the National Salvation Revolutionary Front did, nor the regime, because the regime did, in fact, use theirs on a couple occasions. Once on the battlefield, but two other occasions to where they had actually used it against their own cities and their own people to crush mutinies, as they did not have the forces available to actually go in boots on the ground, because they needed all available forces to fight on the battlefield against the other factions. So they had to resort to firing chemical weapons on their own cities and their own loyalist areas to crush any signs of mutiny or revolt within their own territory, as they needed, again, all available boots on the ground to fight against the other factions. And I'm talking about the rogue globalist regime and how they dealt with things in their own territory here. Now, as far as the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, again, in the last video, before it cut me off, I was talking about some of the atrocities committed within their penal facilities that they ran. Now, before many of their atrocities were moved into the prison systems, they were conducted out in the field via mass hangings with gallows or via mass firing squads, like battlefield types of executions. But they would go town to town, city to city, and line people up and mow them down. Now, what they did to their worst enemies was they doused them with small amounts of petrol and lit them on fire after tying them to stakes as such. And they typically saved that type of elimination for regime leadership or the worst types of enemies that they had. Now, as for everybody else, those they didn't want to necessarily kill, but that they wanted to keep as a testament to their brutality to strike fear in the enemies as a form of living fear propaganda, they hacked off their arms or legs and then cut them loose after cauterizing the wounds that they created by sticking them with hot irons where they had cut the limbs off so that they wouldn't bleed out, and then they would release them to spread the message. Now, there were other evil factions, and another faction I will cover that committed atrocities is the rogue globalist regime. And again, I'm going to show the chemical weapon aspect one more time because this also applied to them as well. Now, the rogue regime was notorious for its atrocities as well. Now, although they had done things such as false flags and different types of psyops and propaganda, they were controlled by a shadowy uber-rich class, which some of which even ended up being the victims of the likes of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front or the M0rm0n State or the other really hardcore factions. But the political leadership was under their control, and they were the ones that ultimately passed the orders down to the political parasites, who then relayed the orders to their commanders to do and carry out different types of policies in the field or as far as how they ran their territory. Now, they wanted their so-called Great Reset. Yeah, James, I have a lot of work about that in the past. You really should go watch all that. This is a documentary series right now, so I'm going to be doing my documentary. If you want to know about that, go watch all my past stuff. Anyways, you would have these shadowy uber rich passing the policies down in order to, what they wanted to initially do was implement their alleged Great Reset, but it horribly backfired. And as soon as it backfired and all the factions and their leadership of the new factions came out of the woodwork and established a new paradigm that they were no longer in control of, everything began to unravel and fall apart. Their currency and economic system collapsed, and with the country collapsing along with it, their money no longer had any value, because their money now was based on absolutely nothing, with the country in disarray. There was nothing backing it. So when they did come out with a new electronic dollar, it didn't work, because in many of their areas, they lacked electricity, so it couldn't be used any kind of way. And also, it was backed by nothing, just like the prior dollar, so it was utterly worthless. They had no more military-industrial complex, nor did the other factions, as the country was tearing itself apart and at war with itself. So naturally, they, just like all the other factions in my documentary series, had to cannibalize other vehicles and equipment for parts to keep other vehicles and equipment running. So, again, the nation was ripping itself apart. The rogue regime lost lots of territory very, very rapidly to the other factions that arose out of the shadows. Their atrocities include the beating and torture of their prisoners of war and just prisoners in general. And they also used chemical weapons indiscriminately. Now, although they did have nuclear weapons, there were 5 factions on the map with nukes at the time of the nation's breakup into the different factions. They were one of the factions with nukes, but they did not use their nukes as a form of a battlefield weapon. They only used them from outside deterrence because they didn't want the land to be invaded in the midst of the conflict. But it wouldn't work anyway for the reasons that I've told you in my past work about China and Russia, because China can get in there and shut it all down, hence their solar winds hack. Now, they didn't know this, they didn't fully understand this, but that wasn't that was the whole reason why they believed that they could use their nukes as a deterrence from outside invasion while the nation was in the midst of an internal conflict. Now, the Mormon State did use their nukes in the biggest terrorist-style attack in all of human history, but it was against the regime faction that it was used. Now, again, the regime was rapidly losing its grip on power. And along with it, they lost a lot of weapons of mass destruction, such as their chemical stockpiles, to where they only had one stockpile left, and that was their stockpile in Maryland, in Anniston, Maryland. Now, they used these chemical weapons on a mutiny that had broken out in an assembly area between some woke militias and foreign volunteers that were angry that they weren't being paid anything and they didn't feel like risking their lives. And because the rogue regime did not want these mutinies to spread, they had their remaining loyal military units, artillery batteries, load up some chemical weapons, some VX and sarin, and shell the woke militia and foreign volunteer assembly areas, gassing them all to death. They also used it on New York City when there was a riot that broke out in Bronx, because the people in the Bronx were trying to turn against the regime because they were tired of the poor food and economic conditions in the regime's territory. So the regime turned chemical weapons on them too and shelled the projects with chemical weapons and gassed all the people to death there. And those were the main atrocities of the regime. Again, they abused and sometimes executed their prisoners of war. But they were really, they were about as brutal in some ways as the National Salvation Revolutionary Front faction, or as much as the Mormon State, but in other ways not quite, because they weren't quite, they didn't take things to the extreme that those other two factions took things to. Those were the two most extreme, most brutal factions on the entire map. But the regime is definitely up there. It's probably the third most evil faction overall in terms of their brutality level. But what they wanted was absolutely beyond evil as far as their globalist agenda is concerned. But the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, being the ultra-nationalist, secular humanist faction, that's just a different type of extreme evil. Because it also is again, secular humanism shits all over humanity, so it's probably a little more evil than even the regime. And so is, but in its own way, in its own right. And so is the Mormon State, because they're their cultish level of Mormon extremism was so just drastically out of this universe wacky that and that's the nice way to put it, that it led to some horrible atrocities itself. But the regime was definitely up there among the 4 top most evil factions on the map of the Second American Syrian-style internal conflict with factions. Now, the next one will be the Narco State. Now, not much is known about the Narco State, so that because they do not have any centralized leadership or centralized agenda apart from actually just taking a piece of territory, taking advantage of the entire American internal conflict and seizing territory, as they did in New Mexico, and part of New Mexico rather, to establish their own narco state where they could work together to make money and also sell weapons as another side business of theirs, which they did, and they sold weapons in a fairly moderate amount to the faction of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. And they did this roughly about the time that the NSRF and the M0rm0n State had their apocalyptic battle for Cheyenne and just southern Wyoming in general, where some 200,000 people lost their lives in the combat between both sides. So, the Raza Narco State was known for allowing criminal gangs and bandits to run wild. It was a criminal wonderland where the people living within their territory were basically, it was lawless, so people were butchered en masse for any and all reasons imaginable. Some of the Raza militants would machine gun entire civilian areas. Such was a common atrocity. The robbery and rampant murders and intimidation kept the population in their territory living in a constant state of terror and fear. And it just led to a bunch of lawless behavior, but in the worst types of ways, to where the civilian population was butchered, sometimes even tortured, and some of the people even captured and sold as slaves. So such were the atrocities of the Raza Narco State, and thus completes between the M0rm0n State mentioned in the last video toward the end, the NSRF, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, the faction I mentioned at the very end when my phone was overheating in the last video, and that I finished at the very beginning of this video, the rogue globalist regime, and now Raza Narco State. Thus are the 4 most radical, most evil, wicked, vile factions on the entire Second American internal conflict map. Out of all the factions that are on that map, out of all 11 factions if you count the neutral areas. So it's really just 10 factions, and 11 if you count the neutral areas, which I don't really count as a faction, as there's multiple different communities with their own interests who are unaffiliated, unaligned, who are sitting out the conflict merely in a state of defense, in a defensive posture. Now, I take you to a battle. Now that I have discussed the atrocities and the economic systems toward the end of the last video and the atrocities toward the beginning of this video, I now take you to battles that occurred in the latter parts of the internal conflict. This is more towards the end of the entire conflict itself. So, we once again go to the map. This is the internal conflict map. Now, at about the time that the Second Battle of the Hoover Dam and Vegas was ending, mostly the Hoover Dam though, the Second Battle of the Hoover Dam had ended, and about this time, there was another battle that was already occurring at the same time, and this battle took place right up here in the Northeast. Now, if you remember, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front had used a lot of chemical shells to gas both the Free American Army forces and the rogue regime's forces at the Battle of Martinsville, Virginia. By this time, their forces and more logistics that they had been accumulating had been built up for a new offensive. Now, keep in mind that the last offensive cost the National Salvation Revolutionary Front lots and lots of manpower to achieve, and of course the associated logistics and everything else. But they had used chemical weapons to great effect to break the stalemate at that battle, which threw the regime in a retreat in disarray, as the chemical weapons had largely gassed basically 97% of all their combat forces that they had left. They gassed them, leaving 3,000 left on the battlefield to retreat in utter disarray. Of course, they had more forces deeper into their territory, but when they finally were able to regroup, they regrouped near the city of Lynchburg, Virginia, where they were finally able to make another stand and conduct another defensive battle. But this time, the Free American Army faction here, who was at the Martinsville battle, would not be attending this battle, as the large chemical weapons attack also used upon their forces, again, conducted by the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's forces, had badly gassed a lot of their frontline troops as well, killing many of them, throwing them also into disarray, and causing a general retreat to the east and then to the south, as they wanted to get away from the advancing National Salvation Revolutionary Front troops who were on their way north and northeast to try and hit and take the cap of the country so that they could install their faction as the true leaders of the nation, as they said. And I take you in just a moment to that battle. Now, when the Battle of Lynchburg began, the forces of the NSRF were on a general advance. They had brought forward some militia forces, along with their vehicles and everything else, that had been steadily fueled and ready for the battle. They had used animal-pulled wagons to pull the petrol, which caused it to arrive slowly, as they did not want to fuel up the logistical trucks themselves, as that would take away fuel from the assaulting forces. Now, being that by this point in time, the NSRF was advancing into regime-held territory that was once their territory, which once belonged to the regime, the NSRF was capturing territory. But this pulled them away from their supply lines, be that their roads that they depended on, be that their sources of food and clean water, and places like their warehouses and facilities where they accumulated their logistical, their supplies, their pools of resources, be that wherever, be that their fuel production, and it took them a long time to bring these things forward, along with transporting the troops themselves. Keep in mind how important logistics are in a battle. They mean everything. So even though the National Salvation Revolutionary Front on paper had these humongous forces and was the biggest armed forces on the map out of all the factions, their faction had the biggest forces under arms, they could not bring them all and concentrate them all into single battles. So they were coming near the end of their supply lines, but by this time, the Battle of Lynchburg was set to begin. Now here, at the Battle of Lynchburg, they were trying to give the regime a knockout blow so that they could advance rapidly to the capital and seize it and install the Troika as the true leaders of the nation, because it would strike such a deep psychological blow to everyone that this faction had reached and taken the cap first. that it might make all the other factions come to the peace table, or at least most of them, and make them fall into line once they saw that the NSRF was the most powerful faction on the map, because they were the ones that had taken the psychological symbol of power, or at least it once was, across the land. Now, in Lynchburg itself, though the regime by this point in the war was unraveling and quickly falling apart, they still were close enough to some of their logistical areas that they were able to fly small prop planes by this point into the local municipal airport to bring in small quantities of supplies. They were very close to where their supply lines began versus where they had been in Martinsville. The front lines of the war had moved quite a bit to the northeast from Martinsville. And the forces gathered were mostly the same forces that were involved in the last battle, where the large quantities of gas were used, the VX and sarin gases, mostly VX. You still have the core forces, as in CORE, not CORPS, which is the unit size, but you still have the core forces of the ex-combat veterans of the prior two wars, and of course the defected military units that defected and joined the NSRF, such as these National Guard units, the 138th Field Artillery Brigade of Kentucky with its attached Indiana battalion of artillery from their National Guard. You also have the 238th as opposed to the 138th. Hey Jen, I love. And you have also the Militia Supply Regiment, which was put together by and for the militia forces. They had finally reached the battlefield. Now, you also had the 5th Jolly Roger Division, with its 2 brigades, fully comprised and put back together with fresh recruits that were brought forward and that came from the likes of some of the militia units. Some of the best fighters and combat-hardened militiamen were gathered together and used to replenish the dead from that unit from the last battle, or pulled from other Jolly Roger Death Brigade's divisions. And so you also have even more regular militias also coming forward from other sectors. Remember, whenever there's a large gathering of forces in one area, it takes a lot of troops to be able to come together to make such a battle occur. It's unlike most of the rest of the areas where low-intensity types of warfare was occurring, wherein you had smaller scale ambushes, smaller units fighting, and, incidences such as, the occasional trading of artillery shells between two different sides, or one side mines roads or booby traps areas, and so you have small ambushes and small little, tit for tat, fighting back and forth, but that's called low intensity warfare. But this is more of an aspect of high intensity warfare, where you have large units brought together into one area where they can begin to slug it out, such as so. Now, you have some of the remains of the 3,000 of the regime forces that had retreated in disarray during the previous chemical weapons attacks conducted by the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's forces. They had retreated and turned around to establish a defensive line as reinforcements in the form of foreign volunteers and some paramilitary national security forces from further up north had joined them in the battle to give these forces some backbone. Now, keep in mind, these forces were drastically outnumbered, as you can see, because the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, their forces had moved forward in pursuit of the retreating regime forces, who now were forced to turn around and face them again in battle. But once again, history would repeat itself. At the very beginning, in the South, you had all of these militia forces headed north, this entire group of you had 12 total militia forces attacking straight north, hitting these foreign volunteers, which caused this National Security Forces paramilitary battalion to have to head down to give them some backbone in their defensive line. You also had these forces fleeing and to help establish this line, as they saw that they would be cut off and surrounded down here if they didn't retreat behind a defensive line that was already being established by the rest of the forces. Now, you had the remains of the 53rd Infantry Brigade that was part of the 29th ID from the last battle. You had the remains of them. Whatever remained of these battalions that was left, they too established a defensive line connecting it to these forces here, whereas these reinforcements, this one paramilitary battalion of National Security Forces along with this foreign volunteer battalion, these two battalions ran and established themselves right here to close the lines, to close the defensive perimeters right here. And then you had also these other reinforcements. Now these are fresh troops, these 5,000 here. You had these 3,000, this paramilitary National Security Forces and two foreign volunteer battalions headed directly to the west and establishing a position here. Then you had these guys withdrawing and establishing a position here. Also, you had this Field Artillery Regiment. It was the 120th Field Artillery Regiment, some of the remains from the last battle, where they only had 2 battalions remaining. The other 2 were utterly destroyed during the gassing at the end of the last battle, the one in Martinsville, Virginia. Now, you also had these forces here. They boldly lashed out at the beginning and tried to attack this militia battalion of National Salvation Revolutionary Front militia forces. They did surround and destroy this force, but continued to assault these other forces, who then, this one here, had called upon reinforcements from these 3. So now you had 4 gathered in one area fighting these 3 here. These 2 foreign volunteer battalions and this one National Security Forces paramilitary battalion that had surrounded and destroyed this one. But by now we're kind of weak from fighting this one, as they now had to fight 4. Then right here, and they were getting artillery support from these HIMARS rocket systems as well. These forces, these militias here, these 4, they were getting rocket support from the HIMARS, who were by now hitting this entire area, as well as hitting them as they were building up and hitting these forces here too in a form of counter battery fire against the Field Artillery Regiment, which withdrew and established itself here. By that point, you had the Jolly Roger forces. You had them surrounding this Antifa force in the city of Lynchburg. You had 6 forces here, 6 of their battalions here. 4 surrounded and destroyed the Antifa forces. Then you had these 2 headed this way to attack this National Security Forces. Right as these 4 finished them off, they broke through to help the encirclement of this paramilitary battalion. By that point, you had this paramilitary and this Cav battalion that belonged to the 53rd right here. You had them fighting against these Jolly Roger battalions, these 4 of them. So there was a heavy, heavy battle right here, where these 2 had swung in just to the north to help not just the encirclement, but to help fight these other 2 battalions. And the artillery forces right here had begun to shell the attacking Jolly Roger Death Brigade's battalions here. Then you also had this one moving here before moving here. And you also had the same with these 3 right here. I'm sorry, these 4 right here, moving up here and attacking right here. So they were now hitting the 53rd Infantry Brigade of the 29th ID in its sector of the defensive line. Now, you had these forces still trying to hold off and protect the airport, but they were to be overcome by these 4 battalions of Jolly Roger Death Brigade's paramilitary forces, who attacked them and annihilated them before punching through to the edge of town, where they established a final position right here. All the while, you had the artillery, this M0rm0n battalion of belonging to the 238th Field Artillery Regiment of Kentucky. You had them move up here and begin to shell the forces of the 53rd right there, the 53rd Infantry Brigade. They were hitting their line as the forces of the Jolly Roger were attacking them head on, while they were trying to hit back with artillery. And this artillery battery, their unit here, these 2 battalions, were trying to hit these other Jolly Rogers that were attacking there. So, once you had these forces, these regular militia forces, break through, they proceeded and stopped right there. They positioned themselves right there, as these forces had already moved up and to try and finish closing off the line, and they were now in battle with one another. So all in all, where it ended, you had this happening. It was something along the lines of this. You had a line like this right here. But what happened again, just like the last battle? They began to lob their VX nerve agent in highly, highly concentrated form. And you had the last remaining forces, again, retreating in disarray. As you can see where these faded blue arrows are, that's them retreating in disarray and panic at the very end of the battle. And they had been destroyed here. And you see that they were about to come in and basically outflank them. You see these 2 pincers like this and like this. They were about to come in and outflank them, but they were retreating. They got away. The remains of those forces got away. But at the end of the battle, once again, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, the NSRF had claimed victory on the battlefield. Although their victory was such that it was a major victory, they were still perilously far now from their supply lines. There were some 45,000 National Salvation Revolutionary Front forces at the battle against some 27,000 regime forces. And those regime forces were mostly reinforced. Those were the 3,000 that retreated from Martinsville that were reinforced by other forces pulled from other parts of the front to block the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's strike forces, who were now pushing further and further to the north and northeast. Now, the 27,000 regime forces had high casualties yet again, just like in the Martinsville battle that had happened before. They had 17,500 total casualties, and that's the regime forces. They had 550 prisoners of war that were captured of their forces that were captured by the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. Now, the NSRF lost 16,230 captured. So the regime lost a little more than the NSRF, but because the NSRF had much, much bigger forces, it was only they lost only about a third of their forces, whereas the regime lost well over half of their forces. So the gassing and the artillery and rocket strikes and the forward attacks, the head-on assaults by the Jolly Roger Death Brigades pummeled and punished the regime forces and smacked them down extra hard to where they were now in a full retreat. But fortunately for them, the NSRF forces were basically, they were running out of steam by this point, because after their 2 victories, their victory at Martinsville, Virginia, and the victory they just achieved in Lynchburg, they were by now getting close to the end of their supply lines, because to conduct any more forward advances, they would need a whole lot more fuel brought up. And they were just unable to do that by this point. They didn't have the means to rapidly bring forward enough fuel fast enough to where they could exploit the gains of their 2 victories. After these 2 victories, they were just too far from those supply lines. They couldn't exploit the gains. That means by exploiting gains, that means that if you have a victory, if you punch a hole in your enemy, you cannot now bring forces through the hole that you punched. That means that now your enemy has opportunity and time, that means time permits for your enemy to close the gaps and plug up the holes in their defense. So, when I say exploiting gains, that's a very important term, because by that term it means that when you defeat your enemy and you punch a massive hole in their defenses, you are able to follow through with it and exploit that and send forces through the hole you just fought immensely hard to punch through. So, the NSRF, although they had 2 big victories, they were unable to exploit their gains because they could not fast enough bring up their logistics and fuel or more manpower to where they could have enough forces to go for another one really rapidly after they just had those 2 victories. So the results was that the surviving forces were forced to retreat towards Richmond, Virginia, and these are the regime forces. They lose Lynchburg, but they're forced to retreat towards Richmond, Virginia to link up with other battered and retreating forces from other localities across Virginia, the state. Regime is losing ground quickly on all fronts due to a war of attrition it was ill prepared for and could not sustain. The National Salvation Revolutionary Front won a great victory, though it required time to resupply, rearm, refit their units, and replenish the casualties in the region. Though they very nearly opened the road to D.C., it would require yet one more decisive battle and a victory over regime forces to decisively decide the fate of the whole Cap region. So, right about the time that battle had been started, another one literally started on the other side of the country, literally a day later. I take you now to the map. As the NSRF forces had a great victory right here in Lynchburg, in this other battle that was occurring, that literally started a day later, after their victory at seizing Santa Fe, the M0rm0n State was now coming down to attack Albuquerque, the biggest hub, logistically and otherwise, of the Raza Narco State. It was their economic headquarters, their financial headquarters, and their armaments and logistical headquarters for most of their activities within their territory. So I now take you to that battle in just a moment. Now, at this battle, you had some 55,000 M0rm0n State forces attacking some 45,000 Raza Narco State forces. Obviously much, much bigger than the battle at Santa Fe in terms of scope and scale. It was a bigger city in terms of the city's population and bigger in landmass. It was also, the forces involved here were even bigger than the forces that were involved in Santa Fe. Now, what led to this battle was that the M0rm0n State was trying to stamp out in their holy war, their crusade against the Raza State, one of the factions that they absolutely loathed and hated about equally as much as they did the regime or even the NSRF, which they had a very, very fragile truce with. But due to their apocalyptic battle that they had at the beginning of the war by Cheyenne, they were in a very, very, very shaky truce, to say the least. But they were utterly, totally committed to annihilating the Raza State from the map and the regime. But they also didn't like the Free American Army or the Union of Southwest Militias, who they also hated. Basically, the NSRF and the Mormon State and the regime are the three factions that had the most enemies, because they basically made enemies with everybody. The Raza State at this battle had no air power, although the Mormon State had committed one F-16 to the battle out of all their air power, which fired a total of 2 Maverick missiles and dropped 4 free-fall MK or Mark 84s, which are the 500-pound free-fall munitions, which isn't very much in the grand scheme of things, just one aircraft, doing that. But, it helped because they used that aircraft against a couple different narcotics labs that were the money makers of the Raza State's faction. And they also used small quantities of VX nerve gas shells at this battle, too. But basically, yes, you had the 55,000 Mormon State forces going up against the 45,000 Raza State forces. And I take you now to the battle itself. Now, at this battle, you can see the force composition here is mostly the Raza State's regular militants, be they Los Zetas or MS-13s or just regular street gangs and thugs or other types of narco militants from Latin America, versus the Called by the Faith forces, the Joseph Smith's own forces. These are the Called by the Faith forces of the 2nd Called by the Faith forces Corps. And Corps, as in CORPS, is in the unit size. About 32,000 of them, of the foreign volunteer Mormons that came from countries with large Mormon populations, such as Brazil, Philippines, Mexico. You also had the 3rd Joseph Smith's own brigade here, and regular militias, regular Mormon militias, who all were committed to the battle. Now, when this battle began, you have this meth lab here, this industrial scale meth lab, being hit by artillery from the paladins belonging to the Joseph Smith's own forces. Now, these were combat veterans from the 2 previous wars who operated these paladins that were taken from the battle just north at that occurred at Fort Carson and the regime's little island of control. Well, now they added these armored and paladins. They had tanks too and Bradleys, and they also had these paladins, which were the self-propelled guns. Well, they added them to beef up these forces as they did their build-up for the big battle against the Raza State here. Well, these paladins opened fire and blasted this lab to pieces and hit some of the militants that were around it, that were defending it, causing them to immediately retreat and establish a defensive line on the other side of I-25 here. Now, as that happened, you also had the Raza forces down here. Now, this is quite a lot of maneuvering going on here. Now, this is Kirkland Air Force Base. Now, this was a helicopter pilot and helicopter operations training base for Air Force personnel. Now, they had military helos, but they didn't have any pilots that knew how to fly them, so they were useless to the Raza's forces. Plus, they didn't have really the fuel for it anyway. I mean, they only had fuel for their ground stuff that they were willing to use on their ground vehicles, because they had to purchase a lot of their fuel that was brought in other, from Latin America and other areas. So they used Kirkland as a depot for all the weapons and drugs they were going to fly out and everything else. You had several airports actually in the area. Now, you had the Double Eagle Airport, which was used as a logistical supply airport with small prop planes to supply the M0rm0n State forces. You also had, which didn't cost them a lot of gas, coming from supply lanes up in Colorado that were recently captured, be they weapons and munitions or otherwise, that they had captured at the big battle along I-25 to the north. Now, you also have the International Airport right here. Now, this would be captured by M0rm0n State forces from the Raza militants, which, of course, Raza used it to fly in and out a lot of their their products, I'll just say. They have another lab up here. They have, let me see, they have two H labs for heron, I'll just call it. They have 2 H labs, and they had 2 M labs for it rhymes with, well, it sounds like math, but it's the other word. But yeah, basically what occurred was you had, in the Holy War against the Raza Narco State, all of these called by the faith forces moved into position. You had some 12 of them right here, moving into 4, 4, and 4 right there, right in these positions here. And they began to immediately get into battle with these singular Raza militant forces. Then you had these 2 militias, these regular M0rm0n militias, move across the Rio Grande and strike just on the other side of the highway at these militant positions here. Now, well, all that went on here was initially, as these guys were duking it out with these called by the faith forces who attacked them, they broke contact and went up here to try to help these other forces contain these other called by the faith forces, as they were having a hard time, as this one battalion they depended on for security in this sector was utterly ambushed and destroyed, didn't even really get to fight back. So that was an emergency. So they summoned all available forces in the area, in the immediate area, to come and plug this gap right here that occurred. So you had this Raza rocket artillery force, which again was using those Chi-Com manufactured rockets, the NJ-230s, the trucks that had the 130 millimeter rocket tubes, 12 apiece. You had about 200 again in this rocket artillery battalion here. And you had another 200 because you figure there's 5 per truck per system. So it's 1,000 troops, a battalion. So you get about 200 rocket launchers per battalion. You have 1 here. And you have 1 here. This one was utterly destroyed by the called by the faith forces. As you can see, they defeated, they parried, and destroyed all of these attacking forces, including the rocket forces here. Now for the battle for the international airport here, you had, after they fought here, They were fighting the whole way around. You had this guy fighting these 2 battalions of attacking militias. You had, after these called by the faith forces, some of them moved here. You had them fighting this battalion, this battalion, and this battalion before they moved ahead, seized the airport with these guys, with other elements of them that moved in from their position here, and just took this whole area before these guys moved from their position around here, destroyed this militant battalion here, so the airport was fully in their control. After that occurred, the fighting finished between these elements, and these forces here were finished. Then up here, you had similar going on. You had these forces destroyed. Now you had the northernmost several battalions of that element that moved in here. You had them destroy this battalion, this and this battalion, after this element punched through and destroyed the rocket artillery battalion and got surrounded by this battalion, and this battalion. The forces, the 4 or so battalions that moved through there, came around and destroyed these battalions here. And upon finishing that, they moved into position right here, right outside the perimeter of Kirkland. Now, up north, you had, after the artillery barrage on these forces and destroying their lab, you had you had this Joseph Smith's own infantry battalion moving into position to check the destroyed lab to make sure everything was out of there, everything was taken out of commission. And as they did that, they checked and they did a battle damage assessment, made sure the artillery struck with precision, which it did. It destroyed the lab. Then they moved into position here, but they were utterly ambushed by this Raza rocket battalion right here, who rocketed them and utterly annihilated them in conjunction with this militant battalion right here. I know the lighting's bad, you guys. I'm doing my best. Now, as that occurred, as they stopped that Joseph Smith's own battalion and destroyed them in their tracks, there still was a pretty heavy battle there, but they defeated that one battalion of attacking forces. Now, while that happened, you had these regular forces up here, these 9 battalions, with one being held in reserve. You had 9 regular battalions of regular militia come over the river and come past I-25 here and attack the Coronado Airport, which they seized control of, causing the same battalion that destroyed the Joseph Smith's own infantry battalion to open fire on their forces at Coronado. So they rocketed Coronado and rocketed relentlessly the forces that had seized and attacked Coronado. And that also caused these 4 battalions here to try to recapture Coronado, but they eventually broke contact as the Mormon positions at Coronado Airport were just too strong, so they had to break off the attack and head out into the desert where they established their positions right there. So, about that time, what you had was the airstrike occur, hitting this lab right out here, and hitting the labs that were located on Kirkland and former buildings belonging to the post or to the base. They hit these 2 H labs and they hit the M lab by dropping their munitions on that and striking those there. And about that time, these Mormon forces that were outside of Kirkland, right on the perimeter, as were these 2, they were basically coming around it like so, like they were about to break in. So all of these forces located around the perimeter were already in a strong defensive posture. And this one battalion of stolen armor and other such equipment, Bradleys, stolen Abrams, they raced to the gate to block the attack from the called by the faith forces of the Mormon State. And they all held their own and managed to just barely hold on to Kirkland. Although the city, by this point, was utterly lost. They had lost control of the city, with only very, very small forces left inside, such as this Raza rocket artillery force that hadn't quite been destroyed, and this one single militant battalion who stayed behind as a sort of harassing force. And these other battalions had fled the city as soon as these Joseph Smith's own horse cavalry forces, again, another horse cav unit, it was the 1st Joseph Smith's own horse cavalry regiment, and this Joseph Smith's own infantry force of former combat vets, the cav of former combat vets, and a striker / Abrams battalion combined together, mixed together. So this was a potent force. You had heavy and light armor, you had infantry, and you had horse cav. So they were pretty well mobile. I mean, they were very mobile. So they had broken on through and reached this point, causing these forces to retreat into the desert and established blocking positions so that hopefully the Mormon State forces could go no further. And basically they couldn't because they were out of fuel by the time they got here. I mean, only the horse cav could, but attacking without any armor support, or other support, yeah, that regiment might have gotten beaten by all these militant battalions of the La Raza forces, provided that they also still had their forces here in Kirkland. So I'll go. By this point too, there had been isolated instances also of VX shelling, mostly against Kirkland. So some of the forces on Kirkland had been nerve gassed to death, but not all, of course. So it was a pretty bad battle for La Raza, but they just managed to hold on to their biggest logistical center in their entire territory, just by a fingernail, basically. So the results of the battle are as such. This battle occurred from August the 27th to September the 2nd. It was a 7-day-long battle. It literally was occurring, it started the day after that the last battle started that occurred. The last battle started on the 26th. Now this one started on the 27th, but it ended a little sooner. The last one was a 10-day battle. This one is a 7-day battle. The results are that the Mormon State lost 19,500 forces, 0 taken prisoner, no POWs, but they lost 19,500 forces of their total of 55,000. So they lost a little less than half of all their forces. The La Raza Narco State lost 17,500 taken POW. Now, of the 500 taken POW, 100 were allowed to convert, and the other 400 were beheaded in the Salt Palace in Salt Lake City. So basically, you had the La Raza suffering slightly less casualties, but because they were willing to retreat. But they lost much of the battlefield, and they basically had less people than the Mormon State, so it was still a higher percentage of casualties, although the overall casualties, it may have been a few thousand less than what the Mormon State lost, but they still lost heavily. So the Mormon State achieved a major tactical victory, albeit a strategic victory for La Raza Narco State overall, due to the failure of the Mormon State to capture much of their logistical center at Kirkland. They had captured Albuquerque, though, largely, minus the small isolated areas where very tiny bands of La Raza militants tried to act as a harassing force, conducting guerrilla warfare against the now occupying Mormon State forces inside the city. But the Mormon State just came barely short of their overall objectives of capturing the supplies of Kirkland Air Force Base, the hub of logistics for La Raza in New Mexico, and it was their headquarters. Also, many La Raza mega labs and huge forces were annihilated in the massive tactical victory for the Mormon State overall. But it was a strategic victory again for La Raza because they blunted the Mormon State offensive, by thereby preventing future ones in the area. Now, understand what that means. That means that basically La Raza was able to hang on, and because they had done the type of damage they've done and denied the Mormon State's capturing of their supplies at their logistical hub in Kirkland, what it did was it kept the Mormon State from achieving any further types of offensives in the area, because they inflicted enough attrition on the Mormon State, but not only in manpower, but also afflicted enough attrition in their logistics to where it would be even harder to gather another big attacking force like they did again, just to go for Kirkland, because now they were spread out more than they were at the beginning with less people there, because they would have to now try to accumulate even more logistics just so they could do another major offensive, because they lost a third of their forces, the Mormon State did. So for them to go for the jugular, they would need, once again, at least another 55,000 troops. But now they were down from 55,000 to closer to about 40,000, and they needed more, because by this point they were deep inside of La Raza territory, because they had just captured a bunch, and the La Raza were closer to where their manpower and they still had their logistics right there. I mean, it was all right there, so they were really close to their logistics. They had manpower close by. So for the Mormon State to strike that devastating final blow against Kirkland and the whole area, they needed to smash what remained on Kirkland and seize all those logistics, smash the rest of the labs that they had on Kirkland and in the area, although they destroyed 2 of the labs and badly damaged the 2 other, the H labs. They damaged the H labs really, really badly, and they destroyed the 2 M labs where they were producing, it sounds like math, but it's the other one. They smashed 2 of their labs with their F-16 and their artillery, respectively, and they damaged the other 2 labs with the rest of the F-16 strikes, but not completely crippling their ability to produce. So La Raza still had weapons it could sell, and it still had its logistics, and it still had the ability to produce narcotics. So its economy, its war economy that it relied on to make war, was not completely annihilated. So therefore, though it was a big tactical victory for the Mormon State, it was a strategic victory for La Raza, if that makes sense, because La Raza wasn't totally knocked out, and they blunted the Mormon State. Because it would take forever again for the Mormon State to build up the logistics and the manpower for a final knockout blow like they had just attempted. So they blunted the ability in that particular region to make another type of offensive like that, another key offensive like that. So that takes us to something else. Now, if you recall on the map, there was that issue of the Free American Army winning itself a big major victory in its seizure of the Hoover Dam from the regime forces. It captured this area from the regime. So basically this blue here, it's basically all gone by this point in the war. Like it's between the Free American Army in the green and the Union of Southwest Militias in the orange, with some Mormon State forces in the area harassing them and conducting guerrilla type of warfare and other such types of incidences, I'll call them. So basically, what is going on here is we have a special operations mission. Now, by this point in the war, what had occurred was it was a special operations mission because what had occurred was Lieutenant General George Harwell, the supreme commander of all of the Free American Army forces in the Southwest here that were in this area, he had been taken by allies of the Mormon State it was a militant group called the Mormon Way. Now, they had their headquarters for their militant group was inside Mormon State territory. Now, it was in the Zion Valley National Park inside of Utah. Now, I'm going to read the background of the mission here. Now, the rescue of Lieutenant General, which is a 3-star general, George Harwell, Supreme Commander of all Free American Army forces of the West, which is Nevada and Arizona, where they had forces, 2 platoons of SEAL Team 3, which were Part of the Free American Army faction now made a daring raid and rescue operation, all rolled into one. By early September, at his East Bank headquarters on the Colorado River, personally having had commanded the seizure of the Hoover Dam at the Second Hoover Dam battle, achieved a great victory for the Free American Army in so doing. Preparing for departure to his main headquarters by air on August the 31st, he was ambushed by 2,000 militants of the Mormon Way, in quotes. The new international Mormon extremist terrorist group, annihilating his entire personal security detail, wounding him in the process, but taking him otherwise alive. He was taken back via truck and then switched off to an all-terrain vehicle to the group's main headquarters / training camp in Zion Valley National Park, just 1.5 miles away from the headquarters of the entire Brigham Young Brigade, whose 4th Battalion and Headquarters Battalion and an Air Defense Artillery Battalion of Joseph Smith's own forces with 2 Patriot missile systems and Stingers guarded the valley from an air attack. The militants were tracked via a Free American Army faction's drone to their training camp. Then they were observed. Deep inside Mormon State territory, a major assault could never be mustered, nor even come close to success, even if attempted. Thus came the one single most daring use of spec ops in the entire war. 2 platoons of SEAL Team 3 would sneak in undetected, plant charges on the Patriot systems and its radar, and then sneak into the canyon to the Mormon Way's base, rescue General Harwell, and evac to the pickup site, the evacuation site, pop flares for a lone Chinook, head back to the Free American Army faction's territory. And for this operation, there were 3 available F-35s, as, you know, I mean, they're not the best, but that's what they had. There were 3 available F-35s that were in working order that would hit the air defenses, that would hit the Joseph Smith's own air defense artillery forces a second time after the charges had gone off that were secretly planted by the SEAL Team platoon. Now remember, these 2 SEAL Team platoons would be horribly outnumbered by like a factor of like like well over, 3 to 1. I mean, these were like 2 platoons, so it was like 80 dudes against, like 5,000 local forces, if that, probably more. Just in the canyon, I'm saying. And they would hit the Joseph Smith's own air defense artillery forces a second time again. Then they would hit the Mormon Way at their headquarters and their whole headquarters base and the Brigham Young Brigade's headquarters. It was an extremely risky mission, and failure was a real possibility. Now I take you to the map right here. Now you had 1 platoon beginning right here of SEAL Team 3, and you had another platoon sneaking in and beginning right here in this part of the canyon. This is the Virgin River, which goes through the bottom of the canyon at the Zion Valley National Park. Now, you have the Joseph Smith's own, and they have set up 2 of their Patriot missile systems that they had acquired. They set them up at the entrance to the valley toward the to the southwest corner of the valley, to guard the entrance from any air attacks. So they had their radar and their 2 batteries set up here. Plus, they had Stinger missiles and other types of air defense systems. Now what the Free American Army didn't know after observing the place at a distance with drones, like where they could like fly low enough to not be picked up by the radar systems. What they didn't know was that the headquarters of the Brigham Young Brigade had a phalanx system. A phalanx system is a 20 millimeter Gatling gun, which can be used as on ground or against air targets. Now it has a radar that'll lock automatically onto targets, and it'll fire 20 millimeter humongous bullets at them. Now they didn't know that, but they had figured via whatever intelligence they were able to ascertain was that this was the only air defense that was in the valley. Now, remember, in the Mormon State, the Mormon Way was a international Mormon terrorist group that came as a special guest of the Council of Elders and Supreme Acolyte Josiah. They were welcomed in as a special guest, and as was the Mormon Martyrs Brigade, too, which is another international Mormon terrorist group. Now, these guys are mostly like European Mormons that came to set up their own little training camps, and they wanted to fight alongside of the Mormon State in the war. They weren't officially part of the Mormon State's command structure, but they were a group where they wanted to get real-life combat training from the war so that when they went back to Europe and other places, they could conduct their... remember, this is a new paradigm, you guys. Like, this is different. Like, this is like stuff that people never could have even fathomed would happen. Now, when they go back to Europe, they'll have all that training from fighting in the American civil conflict. Sort of like how people went to Syria to fight in the Syrian civil war to go back to Europe or wherever so that they can conduct their own types of things. I'll just put it... it's the same concept with the Mormon State and their Mormon extremist groups that came in to fight alongside of them, alongside the Mormon State. So these are the equivalent of like is or the tally to the ban, and this is like the equivalent of like Al-Qaeda. So, they're the ones that carried out the, they acted as a proxy for the Mormon State, and the Mormon State technicians rigged up the nuke, and they used them to drive the nuke into San Diego to, do that whole thing. But this is so they could rescue the general that was taken by these guys and being held at their training camp headquarters right here in the valley. Now, this is the Brigham Young Brigade's headquarters right here. And this is one of their training camps for the Brigham Young Brigade's militant forces here that belong to the Mormon State. Now remember, these guys are just like their terrorist allies here. But they're being protected by the Mormon State because they're viewed as honored guests by Supreme Acolyte Josiah. So basically what occurred was you had one platoon sneaking in here, planting charges on the Patriot missile systems that that this battalion of Joseph Smith's own air defense artillery forces was manning and maintaining. So these 2 batteries had been, and the radar had charges planted on them, before they then moved to this side and rappelled down the cliff and went along the valley floor, across the river, and went and established a position right here to quietly wait for this one here to rappel down the cliff and wait right here near the Mormon Way's training camp. So what they then did was they snuck in, they freed the general, they killed the guys guarding him, whatever. Then they took the general, they freed him, and they made for their extraction point right here, somewhat safe distance away. Now, they had to guard the landing zone before the Chinook flew in. But what happened was the charges went off. They radioed the headquarters of the Brigham Young Brigade, who in turn called their allies down here and told them what happened. So these guys are freaking out. The Mormon Way extremists are freaking out, and these guys told their 4th Battalion to go link up with them and find out what the hell's going on. So they're on the way. Now, as this is going on, these Mormon Way militants figure out the general's been freed. So as that's happening, these F-35s are flying in now. Now this one goes to hit the air defense artillery site, but one of the Joseph Smith's own M0rm0n State forces shoots a stinger and knocks out this F-35, destroying it. Now these other two had gone around and they had, sorry about the shadows and lighting and everything, but here, they went down here, they hit the Mormon Way's militant training camp and headquarters, and then they flew up to hit the Brigham Young Brigade's headquarters. But what they didn't know was there was a phalanx system here. So the phalanx system began to fire, and the two F-35s began to take off because they're like, oh, hell, there's, we're being shot at still, so they're being fired at by this phalanx system that locked onto one of them. Well, the one of them jettisoned some flares, like they fired some chaff and chaff and flares and such, to get the radar off of its trail. But it was too late. They had been hit, but one of them managed to limp all the way back to Nellis, whereas the other one crash landed on the way back because it had holes in it. So by that point, they were guarding the landing zone, these two platoons, so they had to fight against all these militants who were now on their ass, and these guys were coming in to find out what the hell was going on. Well, the Chinook comes in, picks them up from the extraction site as they're fighting, and ferries them all out. And they managed to evacuate most of the dead, so I'll go and read the results. So basically what occurred at this mission was you had the results being that the casualties were some 830 M0rm0n State casualties that were killed in the airstrikes by some, some heavy munitions that were dropped on them. You have 1,050 M0rm0n Way terrorists that were killed. And that was between a combo of being shot in firefights that occurred near the landing zone where the Navy SEALs were being picked up because they got in a firefight where the Navy SEALs had to guard the whole LZ, the whole landing zone, until their way out got there to pick them up. Well, some of them died in firefights, and some of the rest got hit at their training camp. So by more air-fired or air-dropped munitions by the F-35s. Now, the Free American Army at this engagement lost 35. So 35 of their, they had 80 people total, 80 Navy SEALs. So they lost 35 SEALs because their cover was blown, as they were guarding the LZ, because the Brigham Young Brigade found out that there was some hanky-panky going on with their air defense site, with the Joseph Smith's own. And, then the fighters came in and, did a ground attack mission on the terrorist camp and also on the Brigham Young Brigade's headquarters and they did a redundant attack on the air defense site. And they lost 2 F-35s. They lost one to a Stinger fired by the Joseph Smith's own forces, and they lost one that was hit, but it managed to limp away, but it crashed on the way back to Nellis, and only one made it back with some damage from the phalanx Gatling gun that was shooting at them. So the date of this operation occurred on September the 2nd. This was a few days after the victory, after General Harwell's victory at the second battle of the Hoover Dam. So basically, again, the results are that the SEALs completed the mission, albeit in a firefight, upon defending the landing zone from M0rm0n Way militants and narrowly avoiding the Brigham Young Brigade's 4th Battalion reinforcements that were sent down there to find out what was going on with the militants. And the result is that, that although a major success, all things considered, M0rm0n State forces carried out massive retaliatory attacks on the Free American Army due to this operation that they conducted to get their general back and hit the headquarters of the Brigham Young Brigades and also their militant allies that they were protecting. So they conducted retaliatory suicide vehicle strikes against Free American Army forces in the area, and they also conducted chemical weapons artillery strikes using VX nerve shells. So that was that. So that was a special ops mission. That was probably the most the most important one in the internal conflict, and it was done by the Free American Army faction to rescue their general, their supreme commander. But they also hit pretty hard against the M0rm0n State and their militant allies in the Zion Valley there in Utah. So that brings us to another of the later battles. There's literally like 2 battles left, and then I'm going to wrap it up, because then I got to do my my summary and navigation part, and that's going to be pretty short. But yeah, there were 2 battles left. By this point in the war, things were getting very, very desperate among all the different factions, but especially with the regime. The regime was having the hardest time, as it was losing on all fronts, and badly. So there is a battle, a second battle of Reno, where it was the regime's last offensive. It was their last offensive, and it was their only major offensive in the entire war. But it was their last offensive, because all their other offensives have been really, really tiny local ones, like where they're not big enough to be full-on like battle maps, but they had really tiny offensives where they tried to see if they could, gain any sort of initiative, which they couldn't because they lost ground everywhere rapidly. But they had one big offensive, and it was their last and only like real big offensive. It was right here in Reno. And I'm going to take you to the map shortly. I have to read the intro. So, at the Reno battle, basically what had occurred was the regime put together some new forces, as they had basically been losing all their best professional forces. So what had been occurring was that the battle occurred between August the 31st and September the 12th. So the regime concocted an offensive. It was their last viable major operation in the western United States. They had 30,000 gallons of fuel available, which is enough for a fast 4-day operation for the forces involved. Todd Ellison of the Union of Southwest Militias was discussing strategy with the emissary of the Northwestern Conservative Army, which was their ally. Intel came in via radio that regime forces were on the move from California, headed to the southeast towards Reno, the capital of his faction, of Todd Ellison's faction, Union of Southwest Militias. Defending forces already in and around the city were alerted, and they were told that the deep urban battle strategy was the order of the day. Deep urban battle strategy means you draw your enemies into the city and basically conduct like hit and run, just straight up guerrilla, like urban warfare tactics on them, and you wear them down, you grind them down that way. So deep urban battle strategy was the order of the day. The order of the day, with artillery support via the captured M198 howitzers taken from the first Reno battle, where they seized Reno and made it their capital. So the regime's force composition in this battle was that the regime in the Sierra Army Depot in California, nearby, restored all of the Sheridan light/airborne tanks and other vehicles, using them to create a new division, as in a 16,000-man force. They used them to create a new division from scratch, using forces of mixed military, many even from the Navy and Air Force, cobbled together with with the remains of woke militias and national security forces paramilitary elements that managed to survive earlier. Hold on. Survive earlier combat, created the new Joint Armored Division, just having had completed weeks of training on the Sheridans and other vehicles, such as MRAPs and tracked M113. They're older APCs, older armor personnel carriers. And some were armed with TOW missiles. Other woke militias and foreign volunteers in their respective battalions as participated also, as well as National Security Forces paramilitary battalions as well. Reno, the capital of the Union of Southwest Militias, there were visiting diplomats there of their ally, the Northwest Conservative Army, who met with Todd Ellison's, who met at Todd Ellison's fortified compound base of operations to the northeast of the city. Roughly a battalion-sized security force for the diplomatic protection of the emissary were present at the compound. They were there at the behest of Commander Allen of the Northwest Conservative Army, and they were there in Todd Ellison's fortified compound to discuss common strategy and the details thereof for future plans against the regime, to coordinate strategy. And total forces involved, the regime came in with 42,000 attacking forces. The Union of Southwest Militias had 56,000 forces in just the Reno area. The Northwest Conservative Army had a battalion, slightly larger battalion, of 1,100, which are the diplomatic and security forces personnel for the diplomats. Like, they were the diplomatic military emissaries that came at the behest of the leadership of the Northwest Conservative Army to discuss strategy and relay messages from their leaders to Todd Ellison. Now I take you to the battle. Here we have the regime's last viable offensive, or attempt at staying viable, I should call it. I mean, where they sent in their new joint armored division, which was comprised of the I had mentioned earlier. They were using armor in the form of light tanks or / airborne tanks, which is what the Sheridan tank was. They retired the Sheridan, but they still have a lot of them sitting around. They at least have about 800 of them. Now, they formed all of these battalions out of the Sheridans. Now, the Sheridan was the one American tank that was able to fire anti-tank guided missiles called the Shillelagh. Now, the Shillelagh missile, it had a range of about 3,000 kilometers. I mean, not kilometers, 3,000 meters. 3,000 meters, which is 3 kilometers, which isn't too bad. But the Shillelagh was a 152 millimeter in diameter anti-tank guided missile because it was fired from the cannon, which was 152 millimeters. Now, that's a big gun, but it was a slow velocity gun. It didn't have like a high speed, muzzle velocity such as like the gun on an Abrams or the gun on any other, main battle tanks. It was a very wide gun, but the shells fired pretty slow. Now, they formed them all together. They refurbed them and formed them into a force. Now, they also had their M113s, which are the older types of APCs that, they have a lot of too. And they had the some of the MRAPs. And they formed them into truck infantry that were carried by trucks and MRAPs. Or the M113 infantry forces here, or the Sheridan battalions. They also had National Security Forces battalions, Antifa, foreign volunteers, more National Security Forces battalions, foreign volunteers, Antifa, foreign volunteers, BLM, and more Antifa, more foreign, and a Greenpeace. Got to throw Greenpeace in there. Well, those are the woke militias. And fighting them, here's Todd Ellison's fortified compound. Now, here's the diplomatic protection forces of the military diplomats that are there to discuss strategy with Ellison and his compound, which is basically his headquarters. And this is like the capital of the whole faction of the Union of Southwest Militias, being Reno. You got Reno, you got Sparks, you got Cold Springs, you got, you know, another compound belonging to the forces of the Union of Southwest Militias. So basically what occurred here was the deep urban battle strategy was employed. Every battalion inside the city formed a defensive perimeter, meaning they used all buildings, they created barricades in the streets, used buildings, everything at their disposal. They even used underground tunnels, sewers, maintenance tunnels, whatever they had, as a means to ferry ammunition in and out, you know, and around the inside of the city. Now, while that was going on, you had the forces of these, forces launching human wave assaults into the city. These woke militias and foreign volunteers and National Security Forces, to give them a little bit of a backbone. They came and attacked down the highway here, 295. They attacked down 295, and they also came through the deserts from the north and attacked and set up a position here. So now they're inside the city, and they begin to be hit from artillery battalions of M198s that were taken at the first Reno battle, which was in part 1, if you remember the story. They took those. They took that brigade's artillery. Well, they began to fire into the city, and they hit the woke militias, the paramilitary, and the other forces. Now you had these forces down here. You had this entire group coming up the highway, and they met these forces here, which they did manage to destroy these two Union of Southwest Militia battalions before they proceeded into the city, being ambushed the whole way by these other ones. Now they're stuck. Now they're trapped. And they begin to be hit by artillery as these guns are sighted in for different parts of the city. Now, other parts of these forces, what happened here was you had this entire grouping of forces here. The Sheridan battalions. This was like the cream of the crop of the fighting forces at this battle. Now, what they did was they band together with these couple here, these other two Sheridans. They stopped here. They came around here, stopped here, and moved to attack the city in several prongs as they engaged these forces here, but then broke through and got into the city, running into more forces, going as far as here, and pushing these two battalions out of the city on the perimeter. So now they were here, in 3 prongs here, but they were now beginning to be hit hard by artillery, and they were stuck in the entire deep urban battle concept. They were trapped, and their logistical units were having a hard time bringing them fuel under those conditions, with artillery shells raining down, with forces firing out of rubble and buildings at them everywhere. Houses, rubble, buildings, you name it. They're firing out of it from all sides. Then you had these forces. The same thing happened to them. Hit by artillery, fired at from all sides by the surrounding forces. Yes, Ellison and his Union of Southwest Militias did lose a few battalions here and there, but, you know, overall, you know, they were doing quite well in this battle. These forces up here that attacked here were already being shelled. All of these forces that you see now that are inside are trapped. They're trapped. Now, these two forces, this BLM and Foreign Volunteer Battalion, attacked, and they broke contact, went and established position here. And then they conduct an assault again with help from these forces, as they finally arrived here, they moved up here as those two moved from here to here. And they attacked, they surrounded this guy broke out and established position here. Now, as that was going on, another big part was what occurred at Todd Ellison's compound itself. You had three Sheridan battalions north of Cold Springs, along with a Greenpeace woke militia battalion. You had a foreign volunteer battalion, an Antifa battalion, an NFAC battalion, all attacking the compound of Todd Ellison. Now, this was a heavy battle. Now, this part of the battle was heavy because they were going after the leadership. They were trying to decapitate the leadership. And meeting with Todd Ellison was, again, the emissaries, the diplomats from their ally just to their north, the Northwest Conservative Army, to discuss strategy. So their commander, their emissary, was there, and their whole 1,000 or so man personal security detail too, who participated in the battle. They moved up here into the compound, which was a fortified compound, and they set up a line right here, a defensive line. And artillery was provided by this artillery battalion here to support all the defenders. Now, what happened at first was when these three woke militias of these two, of this NFAC, Antifa, and foreign volunteer militia attacked, they were repulsed by artillery. It got too hot and heavy for them. So they all retreated and established a position here to get out of the artillery shelling. So they thought they were going to be all, hardcore and try and do a human wave assault, only to run into artillery and get slaughtered. And whatever remained of them ran off. They retreated. They utterly retreated. But they did their job as human wave attackers. And then what occurred was that you had, while that was going on, you had these three battalions of the tanks with the Greenpeace guys in front of them doing an assault, a human wave assault here. Now, as they were coming in to attack the compound, you had the three light tank battalions coming up behind them. Now, they did destroy this one militia battalion here of Ellison's forces. Actually, two of them. These Sheridan tanks did. Those three Sheridan tank battalions came in hard. Now, most of the Greenpeace guys were annihilated, of course, but you had the Sheridans come in behind them and attack really hard and destroy those two battalions. This one managed to form a defensive line, a perimeter around itself, and ambush it from the side, hitting them from their flanks, while these allies from the security detail of their diplomats had formed the perimeter at the compound, along with these forces all moving in to hit them from the south. So what they did essentially was they surrounded them and protected the compound too at the same time. So they fought them from the front at the compound and from both sides, from north and south, and they hit them with artillery shells as this battalion moved further back to get a better bead on the, you see how they shelled right here? They were hitting some of the battalions that were here. So what they did was they stopped those battalions in their track. They saved the day. They saved, Ellison and his command from being annihilated and decapitated. So they held them off at that battle. And they utterly had the rest entrapped in the city. And they were being basically annihilated little by little from the guns that were sighted in, the howitzers sighted in from this other fortified compound that were hitting them all over the city. And all of these various battalions with the little rings around them, that means they're all in a 360 perimeter. So they were ambushing those forces, and they had them trapped and right where they wanted them, inside the city. Eventually, at the end of the battle, the forces of the regime ran out of gas, so their vehicles were utterly worthless, and they were sitting ducks. Many of them opted to surrender or retreat. So yes, the total casualties of this battle is that you had The regime losing of its 42,000, some 22,000 died. They were casualties. You had 17,000 surrendering as POWs inside of the city. They gave up. They gave up. The Union of Southwest Militias, of its 56,000, it only lost 9,000 and 1,300 who were POWs, some of which were repatriated, while the rest had been sent off to regime forces outside the city, where they could be taken back to California and other regime-controlled areas, to POW centers. The Northwest Conservative Army, out of its diplomatic protection forces, its personal security detail for its diplomatic commanders, of its 1,100, its 1,100 troops there who were part of the battle, they lost 300 troops out of their 1,100, and 10 were POWs. But they were all repatriated, as the ones that were captured at the battle ended up being repatriated because they defeated the forces at the compound. Like, they literally stopped them in their tracks, like right there. Like, they defeated them right there. So the people that were captured were returned. The 10 that were captured, they got returned. They were repatriated. So all in all, the regime lost heavy. It lost heavy. Its unit that it put together from scratch was utterly, basically crushed. It was annihilated. And that was their last major attempt at any sort of offensive. Now I go to the final battle. Right here. Speaking of the battle at Reno that had occurred here, just to the north, right about the time the regime's offensive petered out and was defeated and crushed, there was a battle of revenge. Immediately, Ellison had gotten on the radio and told all available forces in the area to assemble on the uppermost northwest corner. And I will take you to that battle line shortly. What had occurred here was that you had, as the regime, the causes were, as the regime lost its last gamble, which failed in the South at Reno, as Todd Ellison discussed strategy with Robert Allen's envoy, or diplomat, who was even present at and even participated in the battle at Reno, even on the compound of Ellison's itself, under regime assault during the battle. Immediately, Ellison ordered all available forces on the northern front to gather their elements together and accompanying logistics, all available logistics, to prep for a combined assault on the weak remaining regime forces in southern Oregon and far north California. Coupled with that, Robert Allen pushed his best forces, making progress moving west towards I-5 in Oregon, to prep for a joint assault all along the front, in conjunction with the Union of Southwest Militia forces of Todd Ellison's. The actual battle began several days just prior to the regime losing at its last Reno offensive. Only a weak, thin, woke line, in quotes, of pro-regime militias, mostly, foreign refugee units, and only two battalions of Oregon Guard forces. They defended the southern Oregon front and far north California front. That was all they had in the immediate vicinity. As the battle got underway, regime forces, massively low on fuel, and other vital resources, and even seasoned or well-trained personnel also, began to melt away, offering little more than a token resistance, eventually falling back in utter disarray. they were at the breaking point. They had basically lost their last gamble, which was to attempt to take the Union of Southwest militias out of the war, which would knock one faction out and potentially get them control over a bigger part of the country again, which would be Nevada and, perhaps maybe even Arizona. But they failed there. Their last gamble failed to take the headquarters of the Union of Southwest militias. So now the Union of Southwest militias and their ally, the Northwestern Conservative Army, banded together to hit the regime now that they were weak. Now that their logistics they had compiled for the operation in Reno had been utterly wasted and it was a failure, now they had no logistics for a proper defense. So now they were hitting the regime hard in a counterattack. And the counterattack was occurring right in this area here. So I now take you to that battle map. So right here, you have the forces of of Todd Ellison here at the Union of Southwest Militia Forces. He had some 8,000 in the area that were together, and he just in this immediate area that operated out of this compound right here along the Route 97 here that went from Nevada into Oregon. And you had some 16,000 Oregon forces in the area of the Northwest Conservative Army who were trying to liberate. Remember, their whole objective in the war was to liberate all of Oregon and the whole Pacific Northwest corridor, basically, by the coast. They wanted to unify Washington and Oregon and free it of all the globalist forces and make it a free nation. So they were on their way to liberate their whole way to the coast. So they combined with their allies, began to press against the thin woke line, in quotes, because that's basically much of what they had left. That was it. Now along State Route 66 here, this is the State Route of 66 in Southern Oregon that connected Keno with what's this? With Pinehurst, with also Lincoln here, all the way headed to I-5, which is just right here and bends up like that. They were on their way to I-5, really both factions were. So in controlling I-5, they would cut the regime's main north-south route. So the regime would no longer be able to run any troops or logistics very easily up to Washington, nor get them into California, both ways. So it would cut their main north-south route of logistics. And they were pretty much doing well with that. So how the battle began was you had them beginning strong with them launching artillery by their artillery battalion of the Northwest Conservative Army moving here and immediately shelling these national security forces here and this Antifa woke militia battalion right here, because again the regime's very short on manpower, so they required the raising of woke militias and foreign volunteers from the refugee centers they ran illegally. So now you have these militia battalions moving into position. You had these two immediately moving forward and attacking, whereas these two here moved into a position here and waited. They were to be reserves in the attack on these forces here. Now, who you had here was you had the 2nd Battalion of the 167th Infantry Brigade, which is an Oregon Guard unit right here. So they were attacking this unit. So then you had this Foreign Volunteer Battalion move forward and this BLM Battalion move forward to offer them some help, some reinforcements. So when that happened, their reserves that were waiting here moved forward to help them. So now it was a 4-on-3 battle, and they were hitting them very hard. And about the time that happened, you had this force that had moved here, aside of the artillery, they'd moved forward and attacked this force of National Security Forces paramilitary here. Now they defeated them and continued forward. So now it became a 5-against-3 battle there. So in the South, going southwards, you had this force move here to be a reserve force behind where the artillery battalion had once been. They moved here and established themselves here outside of Pinehurst. So you had this armor battalion here and these two militia battalions here being the spearhead force. Now remember, they had fully fueled up their vehicles, their technicals, their trucks, their tanks and Bradleys. They had fueled them all up for this offensive. Now they pushed through Pinehurst, which was abandoned by the regime at this point because they had been in retreat ever since their battle in the south had been failing. Now they moved through Pinehurst, up 66 here, the highway, the state highway, and attacked this National Security Forces battalion here, utterly annihilating them before moving inside of Lincoln itself to clear it of any possible regime forces. And they waited inside of Lincoln. Now, the artillery had also hit this battalion, which had weakened it, making it even easier to destroy before they moved in. Now, this Antifa battalion, this National Security Force, these other two Antifa battalions came together here beside this battalion of the 1st of the 82nd, the 1st Squadron of the 82nd Cavalry Regiment, also an Oregon National Guard unit. Now, about the time that happened, you had the forces victorious here. You had all these various militia forces victorious here. They had moved south and established themselves here, while the armor battalion and the two militia battalions had established themselves here. So they were two different forces that had gathered here. Now, the artillery had already hit them, causing them to band together. By about that time, these forces had already shifted. This foreign volunteer force had moved up, as had this BLM force that initially retreated from an attack coming from the forces of the Union of Southwest Militias who had attacked into California. Now, what happened was their artillery began by shelling this Antifa battalion, and this other Antifa battalion, and this one here, who were holding the frontier of the regime territory. Well, they all retreated and established a battle front here, retreating from the artillery. Now, it wasn't easy for the artillery to follow behind, but they did. They moved one time here. But by the time they had done that, their logistical forces, they had a militia logistical force right here, and an armor battalion here that they put together from captured tanks. Now, they moved forward and attacked the woke militias with their armor and defeated these two before moving down and finishing that one off, and then moving and establishing a position here. That was when this guy fled here, this BLM battalion, and then they came together to move here. That was because by this point, all this movement up here had occurred in southern Oregon, and they were now at Lincoln. And the final defensive lines of the regime were just before I-5 right here. I-5 is just off the map because it's right there. Now, they stopped short here because they had just enough fuel to conduct all the movements that they've conducted. Now that logistical force would have to go back, go all the way back to the compound, get more fuel, wait for it to come from wherever it was coming from, then move all the way back to this unit, which had to use its fuel sparingly. It couldn't keep going forward or it would get stuck and stranded because it would be out of gas. It had to wait here. So that's how logistics affect battles, y'all. And these guys are still guarding this part of 5. And their part of it would have been to destroy this, but that never occurred in this battle. What did occur instead was up here, you had these forces that were gathered here already. They punched through and attacked these forces right here. They hit this BLM battalion, this foreign volunteer battalion, this foreign volunteer battalion, and these battalions that were all gathered together, this 1st of the 82nd, and these these 3 woke militias and this paramilitary battalion who had been rushed up to try and stop a breakthrough along 66. So right now you had these units who had already attacked and came down here. You had this one, so that makes 5 militias that had come here. Then you had the armor and these 2. So they were all attacking in tandem. So some 8 battalions, including 1 armor, were attacking the forces here, which was all that was left. and they were really battered, and the regime was about to lose. So right about that point, you have the end of the battle. And that is the last major battle of the war that occurred from September the 9th to September the 14th. Now, what you had is you had 20,000 regime forces, and you had the Allies cooperating, which were the Northwest Conservative Army of 16,000 and the Union of Southwest Militias of 8,000. They were cooperating against the regime. So the regime at this battle lost 10,000 casualties and 2,000 taken as prisoners of war. You had the Northwest Conservative Army, who lost 4,000 and 450 taken prisoner, and now 200 were executed by the regime out of anger. And you had the Union of Southwest Militias only lost 380 because they only sent really those 2 battalions out, the logistical one and their armored battalion. So they lost very few, comparatively speaking. Now, and that was of their 2,000 that actually got out there and attacked, because their artillery did most of the work in the South, between the Union of Southwest Militias and the regime forces. So in the North, that was where the most heavy fighting occurred. So now the conclusion is the regime and pro-regime forces were crushed along Route 66 in southern Oregon, leading to a road opening for the Northwest Conservative Army to race to the west, to the coast, to liberate the Northwest once and for all. Also, California was now breached by the Union of Southwest Militias to be able to exploit their gains and seize I-5 to the south, to prep for a final knockout blow to the coast of California, once and for all, separating the northern and southern regime forces along the west coast. Now, I hope everybody learned something, because I hope everybody learned something from this documentary series, because about the time that battle had occurred, all sides had used up a lot of logistical capabilities. And the war had basically drug on and become an issue of just deteriorating into low-intensity warfare. Still highly destructive, but the major offensives were over, and a new war was about to begin, the Chinese and Russian invasion of the United States via their hybrid war doctrines. They had begun to see that the United States had been so battered and so ripped apart that they could virtually just walk in and take what they wanted, and they were preparing to mercilessly crush it even so. But I wanted to go over how to navigate these types of situations. An internal conflict would be very, very similar in many ways to the invasion conflict I made. Now, you saw the different factions, and I explained in great, vast details what they were all after, how their economies functioned, how logistics worked in battles. I showed you battles, I showed you atrocities, I showed you economics, I showed you every aspect, form, and facet of such an occurrence, factions, how they rose up, what motivated them, what they were after, goals, everything. I showed you everything. So what best to do to navigate such a situation? Well, I'm going to put it like this. A lot of it in an internal conflict with factions depends on where you are geographically and who takes control in your specific area. Now, refugees would be a humongous thing in an internal conflict. So would diseases, waterborne diseases, sanitation issues killing off a lot of people, dysentery, cholera, typhus from breakdowns in society and the trash piling up and lack of services. It would cause so many things to occur. Now you have to remember, the best thing you can do is learn how to defend yourself, arm yourself, defend yourself, train with your personal protection equipment, whatever you choose to arm yourself with, train with it, and become effective with it. You also have to learn to be a strictly defensive person only. Do not be a reactionary idiot that goes out and gets themselves butchered. You want to stay sort of, in the shadows in such a occurrence as an internal conflict. You don't want to make yourself any sort of you don't want to stand out. You want to pay attention to whatever sort of factions or whatever take over in your area. You want to pay attention to what they're all about and not provoke them to, to wrath against you. And you also want to be in isolated areas. You want to be away from where any sort of action is going on. You want to have the opportunity to be, not any sort of a target, obviously, and you want to be able to defend yourself. You want to have a safe place. You do not want to be in cities, obviously, just like in the invasion scenario. Cities are bad news, whether it's an internal conflict or an outside invasion, well, inside and outside at the same time, due to the Trojans and the hybrid war doctrines, but you know what I'm saying. You don't want to be where there's lots of people. That's like the biggest rule. You want to be a strictly defensive person. That's another big rule. And you don't want to stand out. You want to be away from things, and you need to also look at things like the community tab story review playlist I made. There's a lot of things about sanitation, small unit battle tactics. That applies here every bit as much as it did there. Now that I've shown you what these internal conflicts with factions could look like and would look like, because factions would all have different ideologies and they would establish a new paradigm. They would all be after different things, just like they were in Syria. America's not special. This ain't special. It could happen here too. Easily. People don't know who's waiting in the woodwork to take power, who for their own gains, for their own objectives. People don't know. You don't know who's out there. And I've explained, in live streams and in this documentary, how those types of things can occur, especially in part 1. Now, I highly recommend that people watch this series the entire way through. I hope people got something out of it. I hope people found this educational. That's what I intended for this to be. It's not entertainment. It's strictly educational material only. I hope people got something out of it. I wish you all well, and you all be blessed. And, thank you. Hey, Jen. Hey, baby. Good night, everyone.